This is something that happened to me when I was a child, and even now, it still gives me chills whenever I recall it. One summer, my parents took me on a short holiday to a nearby tourist spot. There was a small, incredibly beautiful beach there, frequented by swimmers and sunseekers every day. It was particularly popular among families with children, as the water here was calm and perfect for activities like paddleboarding. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to swim at that time, so I could only play by the shore for most of the time. One day we went to the beach as usual. Although it wasn't yet noon, there were already many people there. My parents forgot to bring the beach tent and went back to the hotel to get it. Before leaving, they instructed me to stay on the beach until they're back and not to go into the waters. So I sat in the shallow water by the shore for a while, feeling a bit bored, then returned to sit on the sandy bank. It was extremely hot that day, and I just sat there, looked ahead at a group of adults and children playing and frolicking not far away. Just then, I suddenly saw something in the water. There was a child. He was floating up and sinking back down, struggling desperately with both hands. Clearly, he was drowning. I was a bit shocked but not overly concerned because there were several adults just a few meters away from him. However, what baffled me was that after a while, nobody seemed to notice that. Those adults weren't swimming at the time. They were playing with their children. If I could see it from distance, how come they just totally ignored the child just next to them? They were so relaxed, and I could even see the joyous expressions on their faces as they played. Realizing this, panic started to set in. I stood up and began to shout for help, but strangely, they seemed not to hear me. It felt as if there were two different spacetimes. In one, I was trapped inside a glass room, while they were outside or in the other space. Nobody could hear or see me except for myself, and I couldn't run elsewhere to seek help either, or it would surely be too late. The weather was scorching hot, and sweat poured down my face. Despite the fact that there were many people around the child, everyone seemed to be having a great time, laughing and playing. But no matter how exaggerately I waved my hands and screamed until my throat went hoarse, nobody seemed to hear or see me. It felt like eternity. As I watched the child's struggles slowing down, I felt myself being consumed by despair. Finally, I said to myself, I'll call for help 3 more times. If nobody hears me then, there's nothing more I can do. So, I mustered all my strength and shouted for the first time, "Help! Someone is drowning!" The sea breeze whispered, waves danced, and laughter echoed on. I shouted again, "Quick! Someone help, please!" In the distance, there seemed to be the cries of seagulls, and the sunlight beating down on my skin felt like it could make it explode. In my despair, I couldn't help but curse, "Shoot! Can't someone freaking help him?" After my cry for help, something remarkable happened. The people around seemed to suddenly awaken. A man looked in the direction of the drowning child for a couple of seconds, then abruptly dropped his water ball and sprinted toward him. In another direction, a woman cried out in shock, then grabbed a man nearby and rushed toward the child. In that moment, it was as if some invisible glass had been shattered, and everyone snapped back to reality. Suddenly, the area was erupted into a flurry of activity, as everyone joined forces to quickly bring the child ashore. It was then that I noticed the child's father was right next to him too. Now that his eyes were filled with panic and his hands were trembling. Only when the child slowly opened his eyes by the shore did the father, overwhelmed with emotion, gathered him into his arms and cried out. Another thing struck me was that throughout the ordeal, no one even looked at my direction. They all focused solely on the drowning child, as if they had suddenly noticed him themselves, rather than in response to my calls for help. I was utterly exhausted and terrified at the time. It wasn't until my parents returned and I collapsed into their arms, sobbing uncontrollably, that I felt any sense of relief. However, for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. It was as if I were afraid to revisit that memory. It wasn't until many years later that I finally recounted the experience to them, but they had no recollection whatsoever. They simply dismissed it as a childhood memory distortion. I've often wondered whether that child could see me or hear me at that moment. If he could, then from his perspective, everyone around him was ignoring him, while the only person who could see him was unable to swim or help him. That must have been an even more despairing feeling. When I was a child, I lived in a very small village where a railway line passed through. Perhaps it's hard for people nowadays to imagine, but back then, the railway line ran through the wilderness, surrounded by wild grass. One afternoon, a group of us children were playing nearby when one of the kids, my best friend at the time, Ted, suddenly got his foot stuck on the railroad track. At first, we didn't pay much attention, but even joking and teasing him. But after 5 minutes passed, witnessing Ted's reddening face and futile attempts to extricate his foot, we started to panic. Some of the kids ran back home to get help from the adults, while 2 others and I stayed behind to assist him. No matter how hard we tried, Ted's foot remained firmly trapped in the gap, and we couldn't pull it out. After what felt like an eternity, we suddenly heard the distant sound of a train whistle. We kids were frozen in fear, but I was the first to react, shouting out, "Quick, pull!" So, disregarding Ted's potential pain, several of us children strained with all our strength to free him. Ted, too, paled with fear, clenching his teeth and struggling hard. But perhaps the more desperate we became, the less effective we were. Despite our efforts, Ted's trapped foot remained immovable. One child gave up first, sitting down and bursting into tears. With the train now in sight, hurtling towards us at lightning speed, another child finally succumbed to fear and began to retreat. Only I remained, desperately pulling Ted with all my might. Then, in an instant, Ted, who had been fighting desperately just moments before, suddenly went quiet. He turned to me, with tears in his eyes, and calmly said, "Forget it. Just let go." With a forceful shove, he pushed me aside. 2 seconds later, I watched helplessly as the train sped past, engulfing Ted's small frame. Shortly after the accident, my parents, concerned about potential psychological effects, relocated me from that small town. For years, I avoided returning, until this year, when I went to a nearby city for a work trip. For some reason, as I got closer, a wave of nostalgia washed over me, prompting me to take a break and revisit my past. I arrived in the afternoon, making sure to check the last bus back to the city. Then, I began to wander around. Everything felt both familiar and unfamiliar. The village appeared almost deserted, with perhaps the younger generation having moved away. Several houses I passed by appeared to be in a state of long-term abandonment, and there were hardly any people on the streets. Feeling a mix of nostalgia and melancholy, I strolled along the pathways, searching for traces of memories. As I got closer to the area where I lived as a child, it became increasingly desolate, feeling completely uninhabited. After making a few rounds and noticing the gradual onset of darkness, I decided it was time to head back. However, for some reason, I got lost in the very place I used to roam every day as a child. No matter how I tried, I couldn't find my way out of the same familiar paths. Then, I suddenly heard a burst of frantic barking. Well, I'm not particularly fond of dogs, especially the wild ones in rural areas, as I was startled. Without much thought, I noticed a door ajar in an abandoned house nearby, and I pushed it open and ran in there, after which I slammed the door shut behind me. Inside the house, it was pitch dark and chilling, filled with dust. Only a small window high up in the room allowed a feeble stream of moonlight to seep through, casting a gloomy atmosphere. Once the door was closed, it felt like everything outside was shut out, leaving an eerie silence. Standing in the unsettling darkness, I pressed my ear against the door, hoping the dog would leave soon so I could make my escape. After listening carefully for a while and hearing no sounds outside, I tried to open the door, but to my surprise it stuck. I pulled and kicked at it forcefully, but the door remained tightly shut. With no other option, I took out my phone and used its light to illuminate the surroundings. The living room only had one small window, high up. It seemed I would have to check the other rooms to see if there were any windows or doors to the backyard. I groped my way into the adjacent bedroom, which was also dilapidated and covered in dust. There was a large window in the room with a big, old-styled wooden desk placed by it, reflecting faintly in the moonlight. As I approached, I noticed a layer of glass covering the desk, underneath which were some photographs. I stepped onto the desk with one foot, preparing to climb out through the window, but when I lowered my head, and with the dim light of my phone, I saw clearly that the photos on the desk, they weren't of anyone else, but Ted, who had passed away all those years ago. I let out a loud scream and leaped off the desk, intending to run. But somehow I tripped over something, crashing to the ground with a thud, and my phone flew out of my hand and landed under the bed. Don't laugh, but I, a grown man, was so scared at that moment that I felt like crying. I wanted to crawl under the bed to retrieve my phone, but my mind was filled with terrifying images, and I couldn't bring myself to stick my head under there. But I had no choice. I needed to get my phone. As I hesitated, my phone suddenly rang. The abrupt sound in the silence made me jump. I missed the first call, but to my surprise, another call came in immediately, followed by a third. At that moment, I started to calm down slightly. Thinking carefully, the only person who would be so persistent in calling me at this hour would be my boss. Given that the business trip hadn't been going smoothly, he was probably calling about that. My boss had a temper, and I didn't know what he was going to say. Just the thought of him made me feel a little less scared, replacing it with irritation. If I didn't pick up his call, I dreaded what he might nag about. The more I thought about it, the more agitated I became. Steeling myself, I closed my eyes and reached under the bed, quickly grabbing my phone and pulling it out. But by then, the call had already ended. I dusted off my phone with a swift pat, but as I did, I noticed something stuck to it. Upon closer inspection, I found it to be a sticker. Oh, how can I forget this sticker? It was the most cherished sticker from our childhood collection. I was ecstatic when I got it. My friends were all envious at the time. But one day, I got into a fight with Ted. As the winning one, I presented him with this sticker as a gesture, a peace offering. It was only then that we happily played together again. At this moment, I began to realize that there were too many coincidences tonight. Getting lost, the barking dog, the door that wouldn't open, Ted's photo, and now this sticker. It was no longer just a series of coincidences. Could it be that Ted wants to take me away? A shiver ran down my spine when I realized this. I pushed open the window, intending to escape outside, only to find another layer of wire mesh barring my way. I reached for my phone to seek help, but whether it was Ted playing tricks on me again, or the phone being damaged from the fall, the screen remained dark. Standing in the darkness, my mind raced with countless thoughts. I thought about the difficult client I had met a few days ago. I thought about my boss's perennially impatient face. I thought about how I spent every day rushing to and from work, with no time even to find a girlfriend. And now, after finally carving out some time for myself, I encountered this. As I pondered, anger gradually replaced fear. I wanted to confront Ted, to ask why he was treating me like this. I shouted into the air, demanding answers. Was it my fault all those years ago? Didn't I try my best to save you until the very end? Why? What did I do to deserve this treatment from you? Are you always going to be this petty? Come on, take me away, and then we can have it out once and for all. But all I got in response was silence. As each angry word left my lips, my anger gradually dissipated. After who knows how long, I finally stopped and began to question whether I had overreacted. After a moment of silence, I tentatively addressed the empty room with a bit of embarrassment. If there's nothing else, I'll be on my way. With that said, I slowly made my way to the door, attempting to push it open, and to my surprise, it swung open with ease. Without further thought, I bolted, running as far as I could until the neighborhood behind was fully engulfed in darkness. Just then, my black-screened phone began to ring again. Taking it out, I saw it was indeed my boss. I took a deep breath and answered the call. Before I could speak, he anxiously said, "Are you okay? What happened? You weren't answering your phone and I was worried about you." Confused, I replied, I'm fine, what's up?" My boss continued, "Aren't you at the hotel? I heard there was a fire there. I couldn't reach you and thought something had happened. Well, as long as you're okay, just take care." My mind went blank, and I didn't catch the rest of what my boss said. It wasn't until much later that I suddenly realized what had happened. I finally understood everything. The accident from years ago had taken everything from Ted, even causing me to bury all memories of him. But he never forgot about me, nor did he ever intend to harm me.